I want to share with you a remarkable story that has developed over the past 50 years, or 60 years. And it is about the peoples of the world. And over these years, we've developed a list of all the languages and the peoples that has really helped define the missionary task over these last 30 or 40 years. And I think it's helpful for us to understand how all this happened. And maybe some of the things I share are unknown to many, but it's been quite an exciting story. But if we are to complete the task of evangelizing the world, we are certainly going to have to know the parameters of the task that God has given us. And maybe I could just start with what is said about the vision at the end of Scripture. In Revelation 7:9, we have these words, "A great multitude which no man could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb." They were the redeemed. We need to have people there representing every one of those categories, the tribes, the peoples, the languages. But until about 15 years ago, there was no list that actually defined the number of these peoples or the languages. And the story of how we got there has been a very difficult, hard slog to make it happen. For instance, we in our own mission in WEC, we have as our first objective to fulfill as quickly as possible the command of our Lord Jesus Christ in Matthew 28:18-20 and in Acts 1:6-11 by a definite attempt to evangelize the remaining unevangelized peoples of the earth before his return. And when that objective was given, we just didn't know how many peoples there were in the world that needed still to be evangelized. And so therefore it was a very important task that people like myself and others worked together to produce that list. At that time, 60 years ago, nobody knew how many languages were spoken. There was no map of the peoples of the world. We lacked the tools for the job. We had not defined our categories. What do we mean by evangelized, reached, unreached, unevangelized, and so on? We had a moving target. Many migrations were taking place and have increasingly taken place in the world in which we live. And we are seeing more and more language extinctions. And so it's very hard to define at any one moment the exact numbers of those we need to reach and those that have been reached. But yet, the Lord Jesus gave us the command that we have to make disciples of each one of them. Each one must be adequately represented before the throne of the Lamb one day in eternity. So we needed definitions. We needed to define what a language is and what dialects are. We needed to define what a people is. And is that too confusing? We then developed the term people groups. What does that mean? Then people started to speak about reached and unreached. What do we mean by that? At what stage does an unreached people become reached? It's not a magic moment, a specific number that defines this, but we have to make those specific numbers, that we understand the categories of the levels of reachedness or evangelizedness. And then increasingly in these days we've had to speak more about, are peoples engaged? Are there people actually trying to do the job there? And how do you define engagement? But the one thing that has become important as I look at all of this is that the ministry we plan actually defines the numbers we use. So for instance, gospel recordings, they want to have recordings in every dialect so that people can really hear something of the gospel in their heart language. But when you come to Bible translation, there's a much bigger task to actually translate the New Testament or the whole Bible. And so where do we define a language that needs the scriptures? Does it need the New Testament or the whole Bible? And so the ministry we plan often determines the numbers we count. And the same is true with evangelized and unevangelized. if we want to see churches planted, at what stage do we say there are enough churches within a people that we can say, yes, they've got a viable church that can evangelize their own people? So all this had to be worked out. And I would just like to show you some of the strands that have worked together to make these lists possible. And I start with the Ethnologue. The Ethnologue was a book that began to be developed in 1951. The first list of the languages of the world was developed by Wycliffe Bible translators. It's a strange thing, they called it Ethnologue, when actually it should have been called a lingualogue, because it doesn't define ethnicities, but languages. But that work, which began in that year of 1951, later became a book in 1958. And by 1969, the total number of languages listed then was 4,493. But now, in the latest edition, that number has gone on to 7,106. And it shows the increasing knowledge has enabled us to put together a pretty complete list of the languages of the world that might need a Bible translation ministry. And Wycliffe have used this actually to define the task of their ministry in the coming years. And they have this vision 2020, that by the year 2020, Bible translation work will have started in every language of the world that still needs translation. But they're also going to find out that probably about 2 or maybe even 2,500 of those languages have reached a size or shrunk to a size that makes it not worth it to do the job. And so this is a huge challenge with languages. But at last we've been able to map the languages, global mapping in the States, develop the technology and the ability to use the language information that Wycliffe had prepared for the Ethnologue. And here, for instance, on this diagram is a map of the 815 languages of Papua New Guinea. It also shows the level of Bible translation, or where translation is still needed. And you can see this incredible complexity. This is probably one of the most complicated countries in the world, but nevertheless that kind of pattern is repeated across the world, an intensely complex picture. But at last we're getting to the stage where we actually know the bounds of the task God has given us. The second strand I would mention is the World Christian Encyclopedia. I've had quite a lot of involvement with that. David Barrett was the one who pioneered this. The first edition came out in 1981, and in that one I contributed the method of measuring evangelicals and a lot on the peoples and the listing of the peoples of the world that went into that edition. The second edition came out in 2001, and that's when the first complete list of the ethno-linguistic people groups of the world was listed, and approximately 13,000 were mentioned in that book. And so this was the first time a published list was ever given. And when one thinks that that is 2,000 years after the time of Jesus, he said, make disciples of every tribe and language, and only in the last 15 years have we actually had the boundaries of the task that we must complete. The other strand that I would mention is the Joshua Project. This emerged as an arm of the 82,000 and beyond movement, which began round about 1981 and emerged out of the Lausanne movement, but with the strong focus, with its motto of a church for every people and the gospel for every person. Louis Bush was the leader of that, and I was one of the leaders of one of the tracks of that movement, of the Unreached Peoples track. But one of the problems that Louis had, he said we've got this goal of a church for every people, but where's a list? There wasn't one. And because I'd been working so hard on that list that had yet to be published, I actually cheated a bit, and I took the majority of that list, all the peoples over 10,000, and I passed them over so that this might be the basis upon which we could build the strategy for the following 10 years. And this became the Joshua Project list. And eventually, after the publication of the Encyclopedia, we were able to publish the entire list. And this has been developed further over the years. And also then the Joshua Project also added the India's castes. And so it brought the total up to about 16,000. And so if we're to make disciples of each of these, it's a huge challenge. Operation World has had a part in this. The first edition came out in 1962 and has contributed much to the Ethnologue and the people's lists, but we deliberately did not want to make our own lists simply because it would just be almost looking like competition. So we contributed a lot, and I ultimately became one of the chief editors of the Joshua Project list, which is now being continued well by Bill Morrison in the Joshua Project office. In Operation World 2001, we published a hierarchical categorization of all those peoples into 15 affinity blocks and about 260 people clusters. This helped to understand that huge number, because so many people began discussing and arguing which names should be included, which should be excluded. And I kept on saying, no, we mustn't look at it that way. Start with the little ones, which we know little about, the little peoples, but rather let's look at the bigger picture and fit all the smaller ones into it. And this changed a lot of thinking. In the last book I wrote, The Future of the Global Church, this was to look back at the past, see where we'd come from, project into the future what the likely spread of the gospel could be and what our ministries should be in the 21st century. But then the section on the people groups, which occupies a large hunk of the book, in fact a fifth of the book, speaking about the future, deals with people groups, affinity blocks and people clusters. And for the first time we were able to map them, not only to map them, but also to show how far the Christian message had penetrated those peoples. And this has helped many missions to restructure and focus on these specific peoples and clusters that needed to be reached. So let me just put it together. If we look at the nations of the world, that we have a much clearer picture. It's not 15 or 16,000, it's now 244 nations in the world. And here you can see how far the gospel has reached in the different countries of the world. There are 155 countries with over 50% Christian. There are another 25 with a lot of Christians, where there's been a great breakthrough, but the percentage has not reached to make a majority. But then we have here the pioneer lands. You can see India and China mentioned as examples, and then we have a few nations where there's hardly anything going on at all. Maldives, Laos, Yemen being examples, where the population of Christians is under 1%. So those would represent the pioneer lands. And these we have listed. But what I now want to show is the people's side. Here you can see the different strands that I've already mentioned, and the different numbers that are used about the number of people groups in total in the first white column, and the number of people groups by country in the second column. And you can see the category of the records shown in each of those publications. And then you can also see in the final column the primary ministry emphasis that motivates the production of that list. The Ethnologue, of course, was aimed at getting the Bible translated into the languages that need it. The World Christian Encyclopedia was far more aimed at showing the academic world that Christians could actually do research. And very few people have actually read it, which is one of the sad things, but it's also quite hard to read. It's massive. But anyway, academic excellence was the primary ministry emphasis. The Joshua Project was really to get people planting churches amongst those that were churchless or limited in the number of churches they had. And then the Southern Baptists also produced a list because David Barrett worked with them for some years, and therefore they felt it their right that they have a copy of that people's database, and they then developed it after that relationship ended, and their emphasis again is on planting churches. And later with David Garrison coming along with the strong emphasis on starting church planting movements, this has provided a strong motivation for the Southern Baptist mission from the States to focus on that ministry. Then of course Operation World, we had no primary ministry emphasis except for prayer. We wanted people to get praying, and we knew that was going to be fundamental for the task to be completed. But now I just want to show those 5 streams again from another perspective. Here they are listed, and there you can see the different editions of the publications of each and how each have contributed to the other. And there you can see that working together to produce this astonishing amount of information that has been the absolutely fundamental both motivation and focus for missions in our present time. And so the whole term, unreached peoples, unevangelized peoples, has become part of our language, those of us who are interested in missions. But just as I showed you with the nations of the world, I can show you with the basic 12 or 13,000 peoples in the Joshua Project list, leaving out the South Asian caste groups. Here you can see, in rounded figures, 12,000 peoples of the 1040 window. And notice how about half of all the peoples of the world are Christian in majority. So we've got a long way. We are pretty sure there's a good representation of these peoples that will be before the Lamb in eternity. But then we have others where there's been a major breakthrough, and that's probably in very round figures, a bit under 3,000, but let's say 3,000 for simplicity, where there's been a missions breakthrough, and where there's an indigenous church that is becoming strong. And in most cases they are able to reach the boundaries of their language area and evangelize them. But then we come to the peoples where there are not enough local Christians to do the job without outside help. That is why we still need to recruit for missions, because in many of these peoples there are not enough local Christians to do the job without others coming from outside to be alongside with them. But there, notice, there are 2 columns there. The first one is about 2,000, and actually a little bit over that in actual hard numbers, where pioneer work has been going on maybe for some time. And the total population of people living in those 3,000 or so people groups is about 2.5 billion, a huge total. And you think of the Hindu, the Hindi, the Bengalis, the Arabs, so many have never heard the gospel, yet there are also churches amongst them. And it gives you some kind of idea of the challenge of even the partially evangelized people groups of the world. But then we look at the final one. There are about 1,000 peoples in the world where the total population is less than 50 million, and that is where there are hardly any churches at all. So although there's a lot to be done, our whole ministry is now focusing more and more on smaller numbers where nothing has happened. And it does point out that if we're going to finish this job, we're not only going to have to work together, but work together with local Christians to see the job done. We cannot have parachute landings anymore in missions. There was a time when missionaries could go out and go to a whole new country or whole new people, and nobody was there. We're not in that position anymore. And there are very few places in the world, very few people groups in the world where nothing has yet happened at all. And so we must learn to work together. And as we see the globalization of the mission force, we see how important it is that we learn the cultures of others and work together effectively. Now, in the Future of the Global Church, I broke down all these peoples into the 15 affinity blocks. Here you can see them on this map. Each color represents a different block, and you can see the 15 into which we have categorized all those 16,000 people groups. And so every people group in the world can fit in neatly into one of those categories, and it helps us to understand. For instance, if I speak about the Arab world, we understand that that is the area where Arabic is widely used, but there are many non-Arabs who are indigenous to the area and where they use Arabic in their communication with others, but they speak other languages. And so we have these major blocks, but with many languages also and peoples within them. But let me take it a bit further. One of the things that we've been able to do is to actually work out the total number who actually live in the areas where they are indigenous. And then we've also been able to total up, to a great extent, those who've migrated out of their area to live in another area. And here you can see on this graph the indigenous and the emigrant. Notice that at the bottom of the scale, the emigrant one is not quite the same as the indigenous one. It's expanded a bit. But basically it shows something very significant. If we look at the world geographically only, we miss a lot of the point. With the globalization that is taking place, we must realize that almost every affinity block and most of the people clusters have diasporas around the world that need to be reached too. We must move in the 21st century into global strategies for global peoples. And so it shows that we have to jump over geographical boundaries or regional boundaries and look at a people group or people cluster globally if we are going to achieve the task. I will show you some examples in a moment. But another thing we were able to do was to list all the peoples by how many of them in each cluster were largely Christianized. You can see in this table here, the orange column, it shows the number of peoples within each cluster where there's a majority of Christians. Now this again highlights the fact that if we're going to evangelize the other people groups within that cluster, we need to use the local people who are in a near culture if we're to see the job done. Look at the Arab world. 55 peoples in the Arab world are majority Christian, which is astonishing. But notice there are 165 Arab world people groups where there are hardly any Christians at all. And so we need that cooperation to work together. But here you can see also one other factor that I want to mention. You can see the different colors in the bars. We've been able to categorize what proportion of each of these clusters and each people group is of which religion. And so you can see how in each of these people clusters, look at the yellow being Christian, look at the green for Muslim, and so on. We can see what proportion is of the different major religious streams in the world today. And so that's all helpful for us to understand the nature of the task ahead. Let me give you several examples. I want to take you to the sub-Saharan affinity bloc. Here you can see on this map the brown area of Africa that would be largely the sub-Saharan black African area. And if we expand it a bit further, we can now see all the clusters. Each color on that map of sub-Saharan Africa represents another family of peoples and languages. And so we have all these people clusters which are named on this map, and all the 1,600 or so people groups of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, would fit into one of those 20 people clusters that we have here. And so we have one major one, which is the Bantu, which you can see is that area in central southern Africa. That can be subdivided as well, which is sometimes helpful. But you can see the complexity of Africa. But we realize that we can deal with each of these colours as a broader entity for strategic purposes. And so many missions are reformulating their structures and their visions to be able to cope with this reality of people clusters. And here again you can see the people clusters in Africa, but I've shown them showing the religious breakdown. Look how many of those people clusters are majority Christian, but there are also some where there are hardly any Christian. You can see all the numbers too, how many people groups are in each category of how far they've become Christian or not. And so this all helps us to understand it. But let me take you to one people cluster in Africa to show how we can drill down to more detailed measurement. I take you to the Fulfulde people, sometimes known as the Pearl or the Ufula, but the most accurate term for them is the Fulfulde. And they are largely, or have been largely, nomadic, and this is the area in which they live. And they also graze their cattle wide beyond all of that. But there you can see the different people groups within the Fulfulde language family. And there you can see the languages, and then you can also see the names of the peoples. The languages in red and the peoples in bold text. And so if we were to see a breakthrough, which praise God has started in several areas of the Fulfulde, if we saw a real breakthrough, isn't it possible that that might affect the whole of West Africa? So we need to be strategic in our reaching out. Here you can see again the breakdown by what percentage are of each religion within the Fulfulde languages, and you can see the totals there. But just to show you another perspective, we can also take the language or the people groups within a country, and I've taken Nigeria as an example to show how this works out, looking at it from a national perspective. And here you can see the northern clusters, the southern clusters of the sub-Saharan African peoples, and you can see them there with their different colours. But now we look at a map showing the penetration of the gospel. The orange represents a Christian majority, and the dark blue represents very few Christians indeed. Notice how far north the lighter shades of blue have gone. And when one looks at the news today, we read about Boko Haram and the terrible things that are going on with this extremist Islamic group in the northeast of Nigeria, and the terror and the sorrow that is being caused through that violence. But notice how many Christians live in that area, and many of them are being killed today. And one of the reasons for the rise of Boko Haram has been actually the success of the Christians in seeing people won to Jesus. And so here, this peoples and languages map shows something of the extending of the gospel in Nigeria. I take you further to the Persian-Median Affinity Bloc. Median, of course, it comes from the Bible, the Persians and the Medes, you will remember. And so we've actually called this cluster by that name because that covers the Kurds and the Iranians and the Tajik and so on, and the Pashtun down in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But here you can see the different clusters that make up that affinity bloc. You can see also the hatching where there are many Kurds, but often in a minority. But then when we look at the Kurds themselves, we drill down to a bit more detail, and here you can see the areas where the Kurds are in a majority. And very topically, we've had the terrible things happening with ISIS in the Fertile Crescent in Syria, and especially in Syria and in Iraq. And there you can see the green areas in the northeast corner of Syria and also in the northern part of Iraq. And in the northeast of Syria is that town of Kobani, which has been fought over and eventually wrested from the ISIS control. But they were Kurds living in Syria. And so those are the countries in that area, and there are the main towns. But now here are the languages. One of the complications of the Kurdish people is that they speak a number of distinct languages that are related, but they often don't understand each other. And there you can see the complexity of the Kurdish people cluster. And so each one of those may need separate work to be able to reach them. I take you further east to the Tibeto-Burman Affinity Bloc. And this shows the people clusters of the Tibetan area, the Burma area, and so on. And now I want to show you something very interesting. How far has the gospel gone? And this is quite extraordinary. Notice in the north the dark blue of the Tibetan peoples who've not been responsive to the gospel. At last we're beginning to see the beginnings of churches in some areas amongst the Tibetans. The same has been a problem with the Burma people, that dark blue area in the center of the south in Burma. The Burma people have not responded to the gospel. But look at the area that is colored orange. In that whole border area between Burma and India and China are a mass of peoples that have responded hugely to the gospel. The Nagas, the Khasi, the Mizo, and so on. These are peoples that have responded over the last 100 years to the gospel in a big way. Now, when we look at the map like that, we realize how strategic they are. And in fact, I myself will be leaving in a few days to minister in that area to challenge these Christians to take the gospel to the peoples around them that have not yet responded to the gospel. And so this shows the value of this kind of approach. Now we drill down a bit more deeply, and we show the Tibetan people cluster and the constituent people groups. And there you can see the different Tibetan languages, and we long to see the breakthroughs taking place there. Of course, it's complicated by the fact that much of that area is ruled by China, and certainly it's a very restive part of the world. But now we have challenges in the 21st century, and I just want to leave this thought with you. As we look at the 21st century, globalization is forcing us to rethink our ministry strategy. You see, we are facing massive migrations that are taking place, and I want to give several examples in just a moment. We have a massive urbanization taking place that is totally changing everything, which is resulting in language extinctions. Some authorities reckon that during the course of the 21st century, 2,000 languages will disappear off the face of the earth. So if we're going to translate the scriptures for these peoples, it might preserve those languages a bit longer, but basically the Wycliffe Bible translators and others are going to realize that for many of these languages it's a lost cause. We're too late to translate the scriptures because they won't be used. The languages are only spoken by older people who live in rural areas. And so this also shows the other challenge that we face, that the smaller people groups that are the least reached are generally rural. And so with the 21st century becoming so urban, the whole focus on people groups has to be developed in parallel with an urban strategy where there's a mixing of peoples. And so we have to hold this in balance. And some people have looked at the whole people group emphasis as something for the 20th century and not for the 21st. That's not true. Both are needed. But here, just let me show these diagrams to illustrate those trends that we have in the world today. Here you can see a rather composite, what is called a population pyramid. I've put one half of Europe, North America and Pacific. That's what UNIPA means. And on the other side I put AFASLA, which is Africa, Asia and Latin America. And you can see each bar represents ages, those who are aged between those ages, between 0 and 4, 5 and 9 and so on, right up to the top where the old people are. Notice the change in the shape, how with the UNIPA green, the total number of people being born is steadily declining. But in AFASLA, it's gone up and up, but is now peaked. So what we find now is a massive number of people who need work and an income and a life. And we see a population deficit shown in this diagram with that blue area in the UNIPA area that is going to be filled whether we like it or not. Whatever laws we passed, whatever navies we put in the Mediterranean, whatever fences we put up on in Mexico, they're going to come because there is a population deficit. And that is going to affect our history very much in the 21st century. So that then forces us to think in other terms. Let me give the example of Somalia, a failed state. Here you can see it, the different areas that were controlled by the different factions in that war-torn, collapsed state just 4 years ago. Those boundaries have somewhat changed since then, but you can also see the shaded area where there's a lot of piracy going on. But those are the tribes or the clans that live, that are in the Somali area. All Somalis, but speaking different dialects, different customs, and hating each other often. And we see where they're scattered. And what we notice is that because of the failed state of Somalia, over 3 million have fled to other countries where they form colonies. They need to be reached. But how are we going to do it? There's only one Somali church that I know of in the world, and that is in Minneapolis in the States. And so we have this demographic change that's affecting the West with immigration. Here I've got a diagram which shows the situation in 2000 and projected to 2050. You can see in each one the Caucasian population that is not Muslim is shown in blue. And you can see in 2000 in USA 1/3 of the population was not Caucasian. In Europe it was only about 8% that was not. But look at the situation in 2050. We find that 1/3 of the population of Europe will be not indigenous originally to Europe. And in the States it'll be over half that are not Caucasian. And so we've got to live in a multicultural situation where everything is being mixed up. So the whole people group approach is not appropriate in every situation, but it may be strategic. Look at the Arabs from the Levant, from Lebanon, Syria and so on. This was a diagram I put together in 2005, before the terrible war took place in Syria. But what do we see today? This is the best figures I could get for last year, and this shows the number of Syrian refugees internally within Syria, 9 million, and then scattered around the world. I put out a challenge at a conference last year that we in Europe will have to cope almost in the next few months, 1 million refugees coming, whether we like it or not. And so all this presents a huge challenge for evangelization. The other challenge that I mentioned is the fact of urbanization. Here's a diagram to show it. You can see the population growth of the rural and urban populations in the world from 1950 projected up to 2030. And you can see how in around 2006 the urban population became a higher percentage than the rural population in the world. So the 21st century is an urban population where all the languages and peoples get mixed up. So we've got to hold these two in balance, reaching each people group and tribe and language, but also how do we reach and disciple the cities. But one thing that is very valid, what we find is that the evangelical growth in the world has been largely non-Western. And so if we're going to achieve this task, we are going to have to work together as Western and non-Western missionaries to see the diasporas and peoples and nations of the world and the cities to be evangelized. And may God give us the vision, the courage to see it done. May God bless you all.